Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome everyone to our webinar today on why would anyone update a reserve study annually. As Chris mentioned, my name is Robert Nordland. I'll be drawing on 26 years of experience for today's webinar, but all of this material is based on National Reserve Study Standards. You can find those standards on our website, www.reservestudy.com. Let me show you what it looks like. This is the section of our website called our Learning Center. You'll get there by going to reservestudy.com and selecting the Learning Center icon on the screen. In our Learning Center, you'll find links to our library, a list of frequently asked questions, National Reserve Study Standards, a list of live and recorded webinars just like this one. I should also point out that the icon with the gold seal and the blue ribbon is a link to those National Reserve Study Standards I mentioned a moment ago. It'll display on the screen anytime I'm addressing National Reserve Study Standard concepts. But before we get too far, I'd like to go over a few tools to help you get the most out of this webinar. There are three ways you'll be able to interact with us. One way is to raise your hand when I ask you a question. The second way is to type something into the question box you'll see on your screen. And the third way is for you to interact in one of the polls that Chris will launch periodically throughout the session. And the best way to explain this is to give it a try. So here's the first question for the day. Have you ever attended one of our prior webinars?
Okay, it looks like we've got over half have, Robert. We've got about 56% who have and 44 who are new.
Great, a pretty good mix. Well, thank you everyone, and let's get started. Why would anyone ever update a reserve study annually? We chose this topic because it's a question that many board members and managers are asking themselves this time of the year. It's my assumption that the common goal you all have in attending this webinar is to find out what the arguments are for or against annual reserve study updates. But one of the things that keeps this industry so fascinating to me after 26 years is the many different roles that people have in relationship to an association. And everybody, due to their role, will have different perspectives and different goals. So to help get a better feel for who's in attendance today, Chris is going to launch our second poll. What's your role related to association-governed communities?
All right, the poll is in process. And looks like we have largely a volunteer board member audience. Got 69% volunteers. No on-site managers, 13% portfolio managers of multiple associations, and 19% are interested homeowners.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. The first thing I'd like to say to these volunteers is thank you for serving your associations. As a former board member myself, I know firsthand that there are many thankless aspects to the board member's job. Of course, there are many rewards, but we realize that this is not your job, and we appreciate your decision to take on leadership positions in your community. But the rest of us here today are here because, in large part, because being involved with association-governed communities is our profession. Here's a list of some of the goals you might have as a board member. Above all, you want to make wise decisions on behalf of your homeowners association or condominium. And controlling your operating expenses by cutting the reserve study update from your operating budget or by minimizing reserve contributions may seem like a wise decision. Minimizing the risk of special assessment is important, as is reducing your risk of liability. To be honest, these goals are all noble, but some are in conflict with one another. Here's a list of some of the goals you might have as a professional manager. Above all, you want financially healthy clients. That means the reserves are well funded, so repairs and replacements get done on time, and meetings are shorter and more peaceful. The reality, though, is that many of your clients are in a position of financial weakness when it comes to their reserves. So in that case, your goal would be to set them on a path of improving their finances. And it is important not to ignore the reality of liability exposure, both for yourself and your management company. Finally, here's a list of some homeowner goals. I would assume that your top priority is protecting your investment. For the average American, our home is our largest financial investment. But your goal of minimizing monthly assessments is normally going to contradict the goal of minimizing your risk of special assessment. Why should you pay a special assessment for an asset that deteriorated before you became an owner? Well, I've made some guesses about what each of you hope to achieve, but you tell me. Get your hands on the keyboard and type in your number one objective right now into the question box on your screen. I'll give you a moment before I move on. This information will help me shape future webinars. Thank you very much. As you finish typing, I'll move on to the next slide. What you may not appreciate right now, but hopefully you'll realize by the end of this webinar, is that every single one of the goals I listed relies on one thing: information, or more specifically, accurate and up-to-date information. In the next 30 minutes, I'll discuss two agenda topics. First, I'll discuss the 3 ways that a reserve study becomes outdated. Then I'll address the 6 compelling reasons to update your reserve study. And finally, there should be some time at the end for your typed-in questions. Type them in at any time, as Chris indicated earlier. There are 3 ways that a reserve study becomes outdated. The blue ribbon icon is a reminder, as I indicated earlier, that everything I'm going to talk about in this first half of the webinar is based on National Reserve Study Standards, which were first published by CAI in 1998. But before we can talk about updating an outdated reserve study, let me take a moment to remind everyone of a reserve study's 3 key results: the component list, the calculation of reserve fund strength, and a calculated funding plan. The term current in reserve study jargon refers to the information being tied to the start date of the association's fiscal year. It's necessary to tie the information to the fiscal year starting date because of the time-dependent nature of reserve studies. So let me see by show of hands how many of you represent associations with December 31st fiscal year ends. Get to the hands raised icon. Great. Thank you very much. That's most of you are December 31st types. Okay, I'm going to put all the hands down. Thank you. This pyramid represents the relationship of these 3 key reserve study results. The component list serves as the foundation by spelling out the scope and schedule of the association's major common area repairs and replacements. The reserve fund strength is a calculated ratio that compares your actual money in reserves to the current amount of reserve deterioration at the association, called the fully funded balance. The funding plan is simply a plan of regular contributions and special assessments, but only when necessary, to allow the association to perform the repair and replacement projects in a timely manner. Here's the reserve study results for a sample association-governed community. The study was prepared in the fall of 2009 in advance of the association's 2010 fiscal year. The report expired, therefore, on December 31st, 2010. There are 8 items on the component list, and the calculated strength of the reserve fund as of January 1st, 2010 was 50% funded. Those of you who've attended some of our prior webinars know that is pretty average. The reserve funding plan was $75 per unit per month with no planned special assessments. So let's start with this association's current component list. In National Reserve Study Standards terminology, a component list is much more than just a list. A component list is also not an inventory of every common area asset. A component list defines the scope and schedule of the association's major common area repair and replacement projects. Let's take a closer look at that component list. For the simplicity of this illustration, this sample only shows 8 components. A typical association has maybe 20 to 40 different line items. Useful life, or UL, stands for useful life. It's measured in years. RUL stands for remaining useful life, and it's also in years. And cost is the current cost. I should point out that from 26 years experience, it's typical for a very short list of projects to have significant influence over the funding plan, and that's true in this case. In a townhome association like this one, the typical dominant components are roofing, painting, and asphalt. The scope of repair and replacement projects is determined by the current replacement cost. The schedule of repair and replacement projects is dictated by the combination of useful life and remaining useful life. Now, let me demonstrate the various ways that this component list information becomes outdated. Remember that for this scenario, this is the reserve component list for the association's 2010 fiscal year. In a perfect world, the useful life would remain stable through the years, and scheduled replacements like the pool furniture circled in red would be made on schedule, and each of those components would age gracefully according to plan. That means that the only reserve study adjustments that would be necessary in preparation for the next year, we'll call that year 2, would be to increase the remaining useful life of the pool furniture after it was replaced, reduce the remaining useful life of the other components by 1 year, and inflate all the costs 1 year's worth. So if the reserve study was updated for 2011, here's what the year 2 component list would look like. Okay, everyone, raise your hands if you follow that so far, if you followed the changes I made for 1 year. Great. Okay, thank you. I'll put everyone's hands down. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation here is that the board decided against updating the reserve study for a few years. And now we're going to see what happens in that reality. As you can see, by year 2, it's time to repaint the building at a cost of approximately $52,500. But despite some obvious deterioration, the board decides to postpone that project for a year, or it just plain never gets around to getting the bids or getting going on that project. Now, if the reserve study was updated for 2012, which I'll refer to as year 3, a professional reserve study specialist could have made the following observations: that the roof, or let's make this hypothetical, the roof was deteriorating a little bit faster than expected, that the price of asphalt resurfacing had increased by 15% in connection with the recent jump in oil prices, that the elevator was doing just fine, and both the useful life and remaining useful life of the modernization project could be extended about 5 years, and the decision to delay painting has caused deterioration of the wood siding, requiring another $5,000 in additional repairs. And let's assume another normal event, and that's that the board found a new landscape maintenance vendor that saves them money, and so they switched to that vendor. But of course, the side effect is that that landscape maintenance company doesn't do tree trimming, so now trees need to be added into the reserve study. So if the reserve study was actually updated for 2012, here's what the year 3 component list would have looked like. Notice that there's now a total of 3 repair and replacement projects slated for year 3. The roof replace project is 2 years closer than originally projected. The elevator modernization project has been extended. The asphalt resurface project has jumped due to the price increase. The building repainting has jumped by $5,000 due to the extra repairs, and there's an entirely new component for tree trimming. So the question is, in year 3, which information reflects reality? The 2010 component list or the one we just created for 2012 that followed all the changes? So you need to ask yourself these 3 questions. In year 3, which information do you want to be referring to? In year 3, which information would minimize confusion among your homeowners? And in year 3, which information would prospective buyers want to see? Well, raise your hand if your expectation coming into this webinar was that a year 1 reserve study would by nature be good for a period of a few years. Great, thank you very much. That's a scattering of about 1/3 of the hands. That's pretty much what I expected. Okay, thank you, hands down. In truth, a great reserve study is the result of refinements year after year so that it accurately reflects the current physical and financial state of the association and provides accurate budget guidance to the board and management, accurate information for homeowners, and adequate consumer protection for buyers. Here's a picture I'd like you to see that will emphasize this point, that of a tightrope walker. You may be balanced initially, but staying on the wire and moving forward on the wire takes constant diligence and adjustment. Now let's take a look at how the second result from a reserve study, reserve fund strength calculation, becomes outdated. This relatively simple computation gauges the relative strength of the reserve balance at a particular point in time. As a general rule, associations under 30% funded are in a position of financial weakness. They have a high risk of special assessments and deferred maintenance. At the other end of the spectrum, special assessments and deferred maintenance are rare at associations that are 70% funded or above. Everything in between 30% and 70% represents a fair reserve-funded position. Most associations are in this fair range. Here's 3 important takeaways about reserve fund strength. Number 1, it's perfectly normal for the strength of an association's reserve fund to fluctuate up and down over time. We call it a sawtooth profile. And it is possible to be less than fully funded and still have a reserve funding plan that allows for the timely repair and replacement of your reserve components, successfully dodging special assessments. And number 3, the important point is to stay out of the red zone, the 0 to 30% funded range. Now at this point in time, I'm going to have Chris launch another poll. How strong is your reserve fund?
All right, they're coming in. We have 27% feel they have a strong fund, 45% is fair, none feel that they have a weak fund, and 27% aren't sure. They have no idea.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. Well, here's the National Reserve Study Standards formula for calculating reserve fund strength. The numerator, actual reserve fund balance, is the amount of money on hand. The denominator, the fully funded balance, is the calculated value of reserve component deterioration. If you want to learn more about percent funded, we have a number of articles on this subject in our online learning center, the library area, under reserve fund strength for anyone who's interested. Now, as you may recall, when the actual reserve fund balance of our fictional association governed community was compared to its fully funded balance due to the component list on January 1st, 2010, what I've called year one, remember the result was that they were 50% funded. Now, being 50% funded at that time was not a problem because many of the reserve projects were far enough off to allow the association to gradually and in a steady manner accumulate the necessary funds in order to make planned repairs and replacements in a timely manner. Again, if they followed the year one funding plan. Which brings me back to why reserve study updates are so important. But what happens in this story is that the board of this association decided not to follow the year one funding plan. That means for 3 consecutive years, the association was not setting aside reserve funds at the rate recommended in year one. So the reserve fund balance was not growing at the rate projected. And to make matters worse, some of the more influential components on the component list were actually aging faster than originally predicted or becoming more expensive. That served to increase the fully funded balance calculation even more. So the combination of lower actual reserves and a higher fully funded balance meant that the net result was that the association's reserve fund strength was clearly heading south. This infographic illustrates the relationship between percent funded and the risk of special assessment. Percent funded goes down as you go upward on the chart. So a low percent funded is high on the page, and a risk of special assessment is the bar left to right. So you can see when the percent funded is low, there's a high risk of special assessment. Special assessments are to be avoided in general because they're inherently unfair to a select group of homeowners. That select group is today's homeowners who are forced to compensate for the homeowners before them who didn't pay their fair share. Now, another consequence of a weak reserve fund, if the association doesn't pass that special assessment, is deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means owners are putting up with cracks in the asphalt driveway, peeling paint, roof leaks, or things of that nature. Deferred maintenance often leads to a higher repair or replacement cost due to an expanded scope of work or a decline in property values. Now I'd like Chris to launch a poll about special assessments. Have you ever been involved in passing or paying a special assessment?
Okay, everyone's voting here. And it looks like about 71% have been, 29% have not.
Wow, that's a lot of pain for the 71% to go through. Thanks, everybody. Okay, finally, we're going to see how quick the funding plan, the third result from a reserve study, becomes outdated. The funding plan is the simple answer to the very important question you'll see on the screen: how much money does the association need to set aside going forward to accomplish all the projects identified in the component list in a timely manner based on the current strength of the reserve fund, in a manner that fairly distributes the financial obligation over the responsible homeowners. Raise your hand if you think this sounds like a good question to you. Have we characterized it? Great, thank you all. I'm going to put everyone's hands down. Since the funding plan involves the setting aside of money each month, each year, or over a period of many years, it often gets a bad reputation, making people unhappy and facing sometimes outright rejection. The most common comment we hear is, "But we can't afford that." But as I've already demonstrated, the funding plan is simply a plan of regular monthly assessments designed to spread out the project cost over the years over the owners who are enjoying the use of those assets. There is no added cost. The expenses are going to occur. A well-designed funding plan just spreads out those costs evenly over the owners, preventing special assessments and deferred maintenance. Now, for anyone who wants to go deeper on the subject of funding objectives, methods, and funding plans, you can visit, again, the library section of our Learning Center, or you can watch some of our recorded webinars. I'd recommend our Reserve Studies 102 or Reserve Studies 103. But let's get back to our sample community. The story that we're telling here is that the association raised homeowner dues 10% as of January 1st, 2010 to cover steep operating budget increases back when they had their reserve study prepared. But of course, because of that, the board held reserve contributions constant at their old 2009 rate of $50 per unit per month, ignoring that $75 per unit per month reserve funding recommendation. And through that political turmoil, a new board was elected on the platform of no assessment increases. So reserves remained underfunded throughout 2010, 2011, and 2012. It's not only possible, but it's highly likely that the reserve funding plan in 2012, or one that we'd create here in 2013, would require a special assessment. If the original 2010 reserve study was never updated, homeowners and prospective homeowners reading that 2010 report here in 2012 would be under the mistaken impression that the association was 50% funded and that the funding plan was free of a special assessment. That's not true. It would be real easy to miss the fact that the association had been underfunding reserves for 3 years straight. The homeowners or prospective homeowners would be surprised here in 2012 or reading their upcoming 2013 reserve study to learn that scheduled repairs were being deferred and that the board needed to levy a special assessment to make up for the 3 years of reserve underfunding. There is no saving money by under-reserving. Expenses always come due. It's only a question of how you'll pay for them. Reserve studies expire for a simple reason. The information contained within is no longer valid after a year. Like the tightrope walker, it takes constant diligence and adjustment. Now, if you have a question about the first part of our presentation, how reserve studies become outdated, now's a good time to type them in. With time available at the end, I'll take a few minutes to answer those questions. I hope that by learning how a reserve study becomes outdated, you'll gain a better understanding of the importance of annual reserve study updates. And now I'll turn my attention to the reasons why to update a reserve study. So I'd like to start this session by posing a question with Chris's help. At the start of this webinar, how many of you would have agreed with this statement? There's no reason to update a reserve study annually.
All right, everyone's voting in. Looks like we have 6% strongly agree, none agree, 18% are not sure, 59% disagree, and 29% strongly disagree.
Great, okay, very interesting. Thank you all. Close the poll. I believe there's two explanations for how many people in the industry have adopted the mindset that it's accepted and acceptable to not update a reserve study annually. There's still a lot of that perception out there in the industry, more than should be. And that's because a multi-year forecast does not mean a multi-year reserve study. Reserve studies that comply with National Reserve Study standards are required to contain a funding plan, the reserve income, and the spending plan, that's the reserve expenses, that span at least a 20-year period. Many people have misinterpreted these projections to mean that the reserve study is valid for 20 years. The actual intent of the multi-year forecast is to give associations a one-year plan with at least a 20-year window on the future. And the second culprit is confusing legislative wording. Many states have legislation that requires a reserve study site visit update at least every 3 or 5 years. The actual intent of those requirements was to emphasize the importance of periodic inspection-based updates to validate the interim annual no-site visit updates. It's been an unintended consequence that many people have misinterpreted the requirement as an all that is needed subject, meaning they're missing the annual no-site visit updates in the in-between years. But let's get back to the original question. Why would anyone update a reserve study annually? I'll spend just a minute or two on each point. If you've heard of the business judgment rule, please raise your hand. It's a pretty, actually I hear this all the time, but I want to hear from you. Are you guys familiar with the business judgment rule? Actually, not too many of you. Okay, thank you. Hands down. Let me just very quickly go through it. The business judgment rule is a term you can Google, and there's a number of sites that provide some more detailed explanations. But in general, for a budget line item as large and significant as reserve contributions, which are typically 15 to 40% of an association's total budget, an annual evaluation of reserve contributions complies with the business judgment rule. But beyond the business judgment rule, most governing documents will also require that an appropriate amount of reserves be collected each year to offset ongoing deterioration of the common area components. So in light of inevitable and ongoing changes to the association's physical and financial circumstances, it falls under the realm of sound business judgment to review and adjust this amount annually. And again, think tightrope walker. As you learned in the first half of the webinar, a current credible reserve study is helpful to board members in determining how much of the homeowner assessments need to be set aside to fund reserves so that all required repairs and replacements can be completed in a timely manner. Now here's another image that I'd like to share. Homeowners are relying on the board to take their investments, their homes, safely into the future. It's the board's job to protect and maintain the assets of the corporation. This tightrope walker is taking a passenger along in the wheelbarrow. The passenger is like the homeowner, relying on the skill of the tightrope walker, the board and management, to get them safely to the other side. And here's a very practical reason that affects reserve specialists like us on a regular basis. It's crisis avoidance. When we update the reserves study annually, it's typical a very simple process involving mostly minor revisions and tweaks. And we compare that to a situation where an association fails to update their reserve study for, let's say, 3 years. As you learned in the first half of this webinar, it didn't take much for the strength of the reserve fund to start heading in the wrong direction, and for an expired reserve study to give very misleading information to its readers. And in our experience, when we update a reserve study on or after the 5-year point, it's typically a rescue operation. In those cases, the association's reserve fund strength is diminished so significantly that the new funding plan needs to compensate for years of underfunding. It's highly likely that a special assessment would be unavoidable. That kind of strong medicine could have easily been avoided with minor annual adjustments over that 5-year period. And a fourth reason for updating the reserve study is that homeowners expect and deserve to know the state of the association's financial affairs. The only way they get that is through updated, accurate reserve study information each year. Consumer protection continues to be a real hot button, and it offers another incentive to keep your reserve study up to date. And by a show of hands, how many of you have followed or been aware of the recent court ruling from just a couple of months ago involving the Tomes Landing condominium in Maryland. It's the case MRA Management versus Armstrong, where the association was sued by a number of homeowners after finding the board had not been forthright on the budget they'd based their purchase decisions on. Show of hands, were any of you aware of this? Okay, not too surprising, just a scattering of hands. Well, very briefly, thank you, hands down. It's a court case that describes an association where the board knew about some significant problems, created the budget, distributed that budget to owners for a couple of years, and distributed that budget to prospective owners for a period of years. And those owners who bought over that time period later got hit with a special assessment, found out that the board knew all the time that a special assessment was forthcoming, and they sued the association for basically misrepresenting the financial state of the association. And they won. So it was a $1 million lawsuit or a judgment against the association. It's a key case that makes it very clear that the association itself is responsible to put out quality, accurate information to its owners and prospective owners. And in all other areas of our lives, we expect current information. We would never expect our bank to resend last month's bank statement or to submit an application for a loan based on our outdated financials, anything like that. When you step back from the situation, to me it seems foolish to rely on an expired reserve study. So why would anyone update a reserve study annually? From my point of view, a better question might be, why wouldn't they? Well, we wanted to give you some good things to think about as you work on your budget this summer. Why to update your reserve study? We're obviously here to help. If you don't have a proposal from our firm, you can get one very easily by clicking on the Request a Proposal link on our website. It's really pretty simple. I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and at this point in time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Chris and have her act as the moderator for a few minutes of questions. Chris?